Hey everyone, welcome to Lubrication Experts. Today I've got a really important session that we're going to go through. I've got two very knowledgeable professionals, fortunately, who are going to help me out because I don't know that much about this subject. With me today, I've got Paul Hiller from ICML, as well as Ken Bannister, who is an asset management consultant with Engtech, but he's also on the board of directors for ICML. So for anyone who's uninitiated into, one of my listeners called it Big Lubricant the other day. International Council for Machinery Lubrication is an extremely important industry body that helps really set the tone for a lot of the standards that we need to be meeting as lubrication professionals. So this kind of comes on the back of a couple of documents that have been released. So ICML 55.1 was released a couple of years ago. The industry's had a little bit of a chance to read and get accustomed to that. And we're recording this podcast in expectation of the release of ICML 55.2, which is a new document. And so today we're going to kind of go through how those really fit together. I think it'll be a really, really good discussion. So both Paul and Ken, thanks so much for joining us.
Yes. Good morning, Ray. Good to be here.
Awesome. So this is going to be a bit of a three-way discussion, which we haven't normally done on this podcast, but it's going to be really good because both Ken and Paul can add their own sort of unique viewpoints on this. So maybe it'll be helpful if we could just jump right in and lay the groundwork a little bit for the discussion, because like I said in the introduction, ICML 55.1 was released a couple of years ago now. Could you please, for anyone who hasn't read the document or is not familiar with what it is, maybe give a bit of a brief outline of the purpose of that document? So some people might be familiar with the ISO 55000 asset management standard. Some people might be familiar with the PAS documentation that sort of came before that. So how does 55.1 fit in with these, let's say, more broad standards?
You set the stage very well, Ray. In 2014, when the ISO came out with 55,000, their asset management standard, Ken was already involved with ICML at the time. It was before my time, but the ICML leadership went through it and realized that it was a very broad document. It incorporates assets and people assets and financial assets, and everything's in there. The physical assets had already included the PAS documentation, but it was still quite broad. The thinking was, here's ICML, a professional organization that's been certifying practitioners for years and years. What could we do to help our constituents use the ISO document when it's so broad? And between the ISO document and the shop floor where all the lubricated assets are, was there enough information that somebody could take the ISO document and actually create a usable asset management plan for everything in the inventory on the shop floor as far as lubricated assets go? And the conclusion was, no, it's way too broad. And the ICML 55.1 document is what bridges the gap. You remember those cartoons where you got like the two professors talking, looking at the big equation on the board, and it says you start here, and then a miracle happens, and then you end here, and they're like, let's focus on that mystery area and be a little more explicit in here. And that's kind of what our document is intending to do, is take that ISO information, bridge that gap so that asset managers who are responsible for lubricated assets would have some direction. Ken likes to call it a roadmap. And so our document lays out this roadmap with a framework of 12 different areas that makes it easier for somebody to start with that broad direction from ISO and figure out what they should be paying attention to as they develop an asset management plan for lubricated assets. If you've gone to 12 different plants, Ray, and said, hey, asset manager is responsible for all these lubricated assets, show me your lubricated asset management plan. And if they had one, they bring them to you, and I bet you'd have 12 different, totally different examples of what these asset management plans could look like. Not one of them would necessarily be alike, they'd have different priorities and different things being considered. And it's, like that old joke with the lawyers. You want 12 different legal opinions, ask 12 different lawyers. And it's kind of like that. Everybody might have their own idea of what would make a suitable lubricated asset management plan. So ICML took this opportunity to get 45 people together in a committee to, put all their expertise and standardize the entire thing. So then everybody's lubricated asset management plans might have some consistency. I think from a career standpoint, to move from one facility to another, knowing that there's a standard out there, we can raise our operations up to this standard. It makes everything more consistent, keeps everybody from guessing what should be in an asset management plan. It's unreal that 45 experts from around the world were able to get together, hammer it out, and come up with a standardized collection of priorities and considerations to be looked at for developing these plans.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's ever been done before.
Yeah, that's really great. And maybe I'll throw this question to Ken, because you're both on the board as well as being a sort of a practitioner in the field as well. So do you have any reflections on maybe how the document has been adopted by the community? Like, do you see it being actively used? Have you seen it change lubrication practices at all in the industry? What's your experience been?
Well, lubrication is often the forgotten piece of any asset. I mean, it's not often described as an asset. Well, actually, a lubricant is an asset. It's an engineered component. My background is actually in design engineering, and lubrication. I got early into lubrication, and it's fascinating where all the failures come from. 70% of all mechanical failures are directly or indirectly related to lubrication practice. And that's backed up by Rabinovich and all the studies done that have been done back to Jost and earlier. And yet it's still, everyone thinks oil is oil, grease is grease, and anyone can stick a grease gun on and lubricate. And it's, unfortunately, many people like to kill bearings, even though they don't doing it. No, they're doing it, but they try to kill it with kindness, as well as other ways, So it's, but as far as the standard being adopted, it's uncanny. Paul's talking about the rule of 12 there, and we have 12 elements to this standard as well. And it's ironic, but there it is, and there are 12 elements that go to the heart of understanding asset management itself and looking after machinery. But to answer your question directly, I think that the standard is still, and Paul will back me up on this, is still sold fairly well, but as a document itself, it is basically a guideline in terms of what you need to have in place to have a best practice lubrication program. As far as people adopting that at this point, I think there's a higher realization that it is underlying to all success in terms of managing machinery and into longevity of the asset, but also to looking at energy reduction and better practices for the environment as well. It's directly related to all of those, and it's not the if there was a magic elixir, it would be looking after your lubrication program. And, and as far as the standard is concerned, because we've now got the 3 elements to the standard, which is a standard for an ISO anyway, type of standard. And ISO describes a standard as a formula that describes the best way of doing something. Mm. And I think we really have hit the nail on the head here in terms of what's the best way to do something in the 3 specific elements of the standard, which all come together. And they're designed to be a standalone, also designed to dovetail into many of the ISO standards that are out there, which includes 9,000, 14,000, of course, 55,000 is one that everyone's where we harp in on. But basically, we're looking at document management, and documentation is very crucial to any management of assets. And we're looking at 14,000, which is the environmental impact of what is you do to that machine. And of course, now we're looking at the actual asset management itself, and what is an asset, and Documentation is an asset as well. It's one of the soft assets, but lubrication is particularly it's a hard asset, and it's an asset that is tangible and one that most people do not understand about. So the key to this in terms of 55.2 also is to actually explain to people how to use that asset and how to put it into practice. I think the message is getting there, and I think only once the three standards come together, I think it's going to be amplified considerably.
Yeah. Maybe just to clarify a little bit, because you did mention three elements to the standard, which I'm assuming refers to 55.1, 55.2, and 55.3. Could you please
No.
just give a... Oh, no. Oh, so what is the three elements, just to clear it
Okay,
up for the
so
audience?
the way an ISO standard is, let me explain what the three elements of a standard are first. Okay, in terms of ISO directive, you have the 55,000, 55,001, 55,002. Okay, so we have currently we've now have 55.0 that's now been done, 55.1 and 55.2. I'll explain what those are first, and we're going to have an addition to that, which is 55.3. And so if you want me to go ahead and explain, I'll basically put it in the terms of which element of the standard does.
Yeah, a brief description of each one would be really helpful.
Okay, so 55,000 provides an overview of a lubrication management system and the processes applicable to the management of physical assets related to lubrication, its principles, and terminology. So it's like an opening document that gives you a broad view of what a lubrication management system is, and it describes it. It gives you all of the terms and terminologies that we're going to be using in 55.1 and 55.2. So that 55.1 is the what. Is it okay? So what is it? It specifies the requirements that of 12 specific areas of control in a lubrication management system, and for the effective and efficient management of a best practice lubrication management system that is the standard organ is audited against. So that's what you actually get audited against is 55.1. Now 55.2 is the how document. Okay, so this gives you I'll give you one is like 60, 70 pages long. The other one is 250, 300 pages long, the how. And it's gives guidance on how to implement, maintain, and control the lubricant management system. And so what this is a blueprint for implementing a system or a roadmap, if you wish, in terms of the 12 elemental control areas that constitute a lubrication management program or system. And what that does is it also gives in, which is really going to be helpful for most people, what would an auditor look for? So these are what the types of things and programs and document management and stuff that you have to have in place when you're going to get audited against the elements that are in 55.1.
Yeah, so thanks so much, Ken, because I think that explanation really puts those three elements into context. Now, I think what will be helpful, because a lot of the audience will have read 55.1 or at least be familiar with the contents of that document. And, everyone's waiting in anticipation for 55.2, right? This is like the next Harry Potter coming out. So I think what might be helpful here is to explain how some of the different sections might look differently in 55.2, because you've mentioned that it's quite a bit larger and expanded.
Yes.
So let's take a practical example. Within 55.1, I think it's chapter 5, there's a section on machine lubrication, and the 55.1 document would outline some of the considerations that you should account for when selecting a lubricant. Right? Now, the equivalent section in 55.2, would that be more specific? Would it contain a procedure? What should people expect from that version of the document?
Yes, that's a good question. And you pretty much hit the nail on the head. There's 12 elements, and in the standard itself on page 2, we have like an interrelated lubrication program rosette. There's 12 elements to that, and it breaks it down into the various sections that come across from that in section 5.0. And so we're dealing exactly in section 5.0 with all those 12 plans that are in there. And each one of those is blown out in terms of a practical sense. And so how would we go about looking at those from a practical perspective and implementing it as such a program that an auditor will come along and understand that these people or this company understands exactly what they're doing. And they've interpreted the standard. It's not a formula for every single type of industry. It's more of a broad formula from which an industry can take as its bones, if you wish, and add the meat to it, which is specific to their business, their typical business. So, for instance, a pharmaceutical company would approach lubrication slightly different than, say, a foundry. So, so you understand where I'm going on this. So you can have a manufacturing, you can have a process industry. So if it's food, for instance, there'll be a lot of washout. There'll be all kinds of all kinds of attacking elements to the lubricants. Whereas a pharmacy, it's all HEPA, pharmaceutical, it's all HEPA filtered and controlled in manufacturing suites and stuff. It's clean room approach.
Yeah, that's excellent. And I think that's helpful as well to set people's expectations of how specific is it going to be, right? So, if you are in an industry with specific needs, like food industry, that the document will kind of point you in the right direction. Here's the things you should consider without being super prescriptive about, no, you must follow step 1, 2, 3 kind of thing, right? Because we couldn't get that granular to every single industry.
Along those same lines, when we first came up with the concept of a document that mirrors the ISO document, but it makes it more specific for lubricated asset management. I mean, to sit here and say, well, ours is still somewhat general and broad as well, but out of necessity. But it takes that really broad, thing, just pushes it much closer to the shop floor in the different industries. All those decisions that have to be made, it's not so broad as in develop an asset management plan. Okay, next. Now it's develop an asset management plan for your lubricated assets, and here's all the things you should consider based on all kinds of information from all these experts around the world in different industries. And it just pushes it much, much closer, makes it easier for people then to wrap their hands or their heads around what's left for their specific situations. They still have to bring that to the table. What are their specific needs and priorities and politics and budgets and all that sort of thing. But it's much closer to the shop floor now.
Yeah, that's great. So maybe another question for you, Paul, as well, would be, we've just heard about how interconnected 55.1 and 55.2 are, right? So there's, basically, if you go through the table of contents on 55.1, that'll be mirrored in 55.2. So how are these standards going to be made available? Like, should they only be used in conjunction with each other? Can you buy them? Would you be able to acquire them separately, or is that really not? Is it not helpful to have 55.2 without having purchased 55.1 in the first place? Maybe if you can help sort of like with some of the practicalities.
Jim's going to have a lot of input here since he's been working with 55.2. My experience has been with just 55.1 out there in the market and self-publishing that out of our office, basically, where I've been advising people that yes, 55.2 is coming, but the 55.1 requirements document can lay so much groundwork that if you want to be ready to use 55.2, go ahead and get 55.1 now. That's why we went ahead and published it in 2019. It didn't need the part 2 right away, but to go backwards, that doesn't make sense to me.
The way we went about putting this together, 55.2 is follows the 55.1 very closely. And as you know, in each of those sections, it may have 20, 30 points that it talks about. We've taken all those 20, 30 points and broken and basically exploded them out in terms of how would you implement that? What is exactly we're meaning by what we're saying in that, and what are we looking for? And so therefore, we tried to make the 55.2 as a standalone document. If you only bought that, then you would have a book. And you would have a book that tells you how to implement a best practice lubrication program. And it would also tell you that if you ever wanted to get audited, these are all the elements that you will have to have in place that an auditor may look for. And so you better have them, because you could be asked anything in an audit. They don't ask you everything. They're very pointed, and they go and they look and they see, there's a weak point. There's a weak area that's not in the standard. That's in the standard, but they've not necessarily got a hold on it. Then they'll ask the questions: how have you gone about this? Show me how you implemented this. Where was your implementation plan? So there's all of those elements. Did you do a consolidation program on your lubricants? One of the basic standards that you should do right from almost the onset. If you haven't got that, it'll tell you. If you haven't got that, you haven't got a program to be put in place yet. So those are if you don't understand your lubricants, you don't understand your machinery. So that's where the real value of this is. It's basically a standard. It will have an ISBN number. It could be purchased alone. The 55.0 tells you how the standards harmonize and how they work together. 55.1 tells you the actual things that you'll be audited on, right? And it goes through each of those points. And as I said, you're going to be able to buy them as standalone documents, or you can buy them as a box set. And they're all going to be released as a box set at the same time now. So there's a surprise. There's the breaking news for you there, Rafe.
Excellent. That's really good to know.
Yeah.
And I think maybe this is a bit of a sidebar question, but one that a lot of professionals in our industry will want to know as well, because ICML 55 felt like it was intimately tied to the MLE certification, right? So the kind of the purpose of setting up that extra certification program beyond MLA and MLT was to ensure that we had some kind of certification which directly aligned to ICML 55. Now, the other thing is that MLE was released in advance of some of these documents, right? So we had an MLE certification well before 55.2 was going to be published. So now that we've assembled this team of experts and they've put together this rather larger document, let's say, has there been any findings in the process of doing that which might alter the body of knowledge for MLE?
Would definitely alter the domain of knowledge, because now we have 55.1 and 2,
Yeah.
right? 55.0 we should have in there as well. But the body of knowledge, that's it. Actually, that's a good point. We followed it through, and we've kept an eye on that, and we tried to but we've tried to make it independent of that, so it's not an MLE document. And that's a good question, Rafe. And I think we're always going back, checking on new things come out of the processes that we put in place. We go back and we're going to check and now and see how 55.0, 1 and 2 all dovetail into the different standards at the different levels. Yeah. And of course, that's at the time, I think, what we would look at the body of knowledge to see if it's not been enhanced in any way, if we're missing or disconnecting at that point. I don't think we are, but it's an excellent point, and I think it's something that we have to do once on the next step.
Yes. And the exams are always the exam question bank is always getting reviewed for content and clarity and updating questions and such. So it only makes sense that once this 55.2 gets tacked into the domain of knowledge, that it's going to probably wind up getting utilized some as the MLE, with just by regular course of action, is going to get reviewed, and that's going to get considered for some of that.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Maybe one other thing to touch on as well, and we've already referred to this sort of panel of experts that help put together the documents. I think some people would be interested into, like, how was that panel assembled? We don't obviously have to call out all 45 names, but how did you put together that panel? And you spoke to some of the challenges of how do you get consensus across a group of 45 different professionals as well, right? Because our experience in the field is often that there can be differing opinions on what is best practice. So how did that all come together?
Boy, that was, like I said, that was before my time. I'm not sure particularly well the details. Ken, you were on that list if I remember right.
Yes, it was.
Uh,
Yes, yes.
you might be able to speak to how you were contacted and pulled in. I know that the ICML leadership, there was a core editorial committee at the time that went and contacted. This is my recollection, so Ken, correct me if I'm wrong. Went and contacted a variety of people who were familiar with different markets and different topics, knowing there's only going to be 12 areas, but you're reaching out to 45, and a variety of them were all writing in all their feedback. And I think there was an editorial committee that poured through that and tried
Yes,
to tried to pull everything into the 12 areas and then sent all that back out to all the players to get their consensus. Say, yep, that looks like it makes sense and is, an approachable way to present all the content. Is that you're right?
I think that's an excellent way of describing it, Paul. Yeah, and it was based like most things on the ISO method of putting 55,000 together. Was done exactly the same way. So it had good bones and good roots there in terms of the methodology. And you're right, Rafe. To try and get 45 people, experts in the room, to agree on one thing is not an easy thing, right? So there's an allowance in there, obviously, and we all know the 12 elements there. I think there was total consensus of the 12 elements. So that's why the descriptions within them, there was latitude to actually give expression from the different people and bring in different opinions and say, okay, well, that as long as they harmonized and came together, then it became applicable. And it's much like going through, if I do a lubrication operation effectiveness review, an LOAR in a corporation, the questions are asked on all different levels for different people who are involved with lubricants in different areas. And it's not always the same question set that gets given to them. But when it comes back in, it comes back to a set within those 12 specific areas in terms of where their strengths and weaknesses are. So you can do the spider diagrams and see where their improvements are, where their weaknesses, and then give them a solution or a prescription for moving forward. And that's exactly how when someone does an audit to a standard works as well. So and everything's interpreted from an audit perspective. So the auditor has to be taught as well, which brings us to 55.3, right? Which is going to be an auditor and an assessor. So an assessor is an internal auditor, and an auditor is an external third-party auditor, a professional auditor. So someone like BSI or SIA Global, the ones that do 55,000, right? So and 14,000, 9,000, because ISO doesn't audit anybody. So it's a professional auditor that comes in, but they have to be taught as well. They have to be schooled and trained as to how to interpret that set of collection in 55.1 and how to understand what they're looking for. So that's where 55.3 and comes in, and it's likely not going to be a for sale piece of it for the general public. It will be for assessors and auditors that go through that training system in there. So it's tied to it. But the three standards, O, 1, and 2, are a complete set, and will go out as a complete set. And that's the end user will take all of those. Yeah.
So that's an interesting point. So I think maybe a lot of people in the audience might not realize that that's kind of the end point of this process, is that getting to a process of actual certification, for ICML 55.1. Now, for a lot of industries, I mean, certification just to the ISO standard is a relatively new thing. Here in Australia, actually, it's been reasonably widely adopted, especially because the government kind of gave a thou shalt be ISO 55,000 compliant if you are in a government-controlled industry. So the adoption here has actually been pretty strong. So could you maybe describe a little bit more about that process? You said that there would be someone individual as an assessor, and then you would have an external certifier.
Yeah.
But how is ICML itself going to administrate that program?
Okay, so what happens next is that the audit process has to be structured, and the actual, what is it we're actually looking for. So there is an element. How are they interpreted for an auditor for what to look for specifically, and the latitude that they can give in various elements of it. And so that has to be pulled together now, which is the 55.3. And then we have to go through certifying auditors to actually do the audit on behalf of ICML, and then the training of those auditors. Now, the way, if any, I don't know if you've been through a 55,000 or a 9,000, an ISO audit or at all, but what happens is that a consultant usually comes in and they will look at your current state, and they will assess your current state and against the standard, and then look at where your areas of strengths and weaknesses are in terms of what the audit, what the consultant feels that you need to have in place before you go through a preliminary audit. Now, and to do that, also what they will put in place, or they should put in place, if they understand how a standard works, is, so what we do is we would put in place an internal team. You understand who your stakeholders are within the organization, and then you need to understand how all of those work together through the systems that you currently have in place. So that's your asset management program, your CMMS, all of those elements that go with that. Are you reporting to the stakeholders? Do you know who your stakeholders are? You have a system champion in there who's funding all of this to move it forward. So you have someone that you're sort of have to report out to on a regular basis to make this work. Then you put into place a management action plan, or MAP, to actually take you down to the point of ready for assessment. So in doing so, you build an internal team who's like your internal quality team that's looking to say, oh, do we have this? Do we have this on a bunch of tick lists? And those assessors are trained to actually, they're trained by auditors usually to perform a mock or dummy audit in preparation for the preliminary audit. Then the auditor company comes in. They will go spend 2 to 3 days within the organization. They will look at all your paperwork. They will look at all your planning documents. They will look at they will do a physical walkthrough in your plant. They will look at your work order, your work management system, your reports, and they will speak to multiple people at different levels. Because don't forget, this has to roll up to management, and management has to understand how it rolls down to the shop floor. That's how 55,000, that's how 9,000 works. Everyone is a piece and a part of that, and needs to understand what's going on. Did you broadcast it? Does everyone know what's going on? It's not, yeah. So people need to know what's going on in the plant, and this is what you're striving toward. So it has to be meaningful in that regard. So that's what they're looking for in that element. They will then go to do the preliminary audit. They'll come back and give you an assessment of major and minor faults against that. So, so for instance, I did this with a company in Canada, and 55,001. It was the first audit ever in North America, and we had to go and teach the auditor what to look for in the audit. So we actually trained the auditor on how to understand 55,001. So it's not my first down this roundabout, right? So it's and then they went through it. They were assessed with 2 minors, and which they had like 60 days to complete. And so they give you time, and then they come back. So your internal assessment group will then go back a second time and then say, are we ready to come back for the real audit? And so the real audit comes in, and once you have that, the assessor, the auditor signs off, yes, you've completed, you are now certifiable. That's then sent to ISO or to ICML, and they will prepare all the paperwork. And then there's a big announcement and a fanfare, and they're allowed to fly the flag and allowed to put ICML 55.1 certified on all the documents and everything, that address plaques and stuff like that, and everyone gets jackets and stuff. But it's not about that, right? It's really about the mindset. Now management truly understands how a lowly substance like lubricant can actually affect the entire organization, and which is what we've been wanting to do for years and years and years. It's the forgotten practice. So it's so that's roughly what it is, how it goes through. So from our perspective at this point, then what we have to do now is we have to train the auditors. We have to put this in place, and it takes on average, well, to perform a paradigm shift, from one set of paradigms to a new set of paradigms and new practices takes on average around 18 months. It can occur in 6, but on average, it's around 18 months to really change people's perspective. Well, they're coming back, you've got it when they come back. Well, I told them years ago we should be doing that. It's about time they did that, right? And they said, well, well, we should have been doing this forever. Why were we back? You've changed the mindset. The paradigm has been reset, but that can take up to 18 months to 2 years. So when someone's going down on this journey, they don't have to have 55,000. We're just doing their lubrication management program, which sets them up ready to go for 55,000 if they want to. So it's really a great stepping stone if they've got mechanical equipment. And it really does a precursor to the big one, the big ISO, which is everything in the organization, right? So it can be adapted very well in terms of the precursive certification to get. And as I said, they can be ready for this if they're really diligent in around 6 to 8 months. Usually it's like 12 to 14 months before they're ready to have the audit space. So ICML is expecting to perform audits within a year to 2 years time, once people start to adopt it.
Yeah. Wow, that's a fascinating insight as well. I like the idea of ICML 55 almost being like a stepping stone, right? So you can get your organization used to the process of audit, follow up, and all that kind of thing in preparation for the big ISO 55000 audit that your organization might be aspiring to as well. So that's a really interesting idea. One last question as well. So what we've basically done in the lubrication community, and obviously it's mostly the folks at ICML have done, is taken this very broad asset management standard, 55,000. I've seen a few people comment that if you do a Control F and you type in lubrication, like lubricants just never appears in that standard, right? And so that really drives the need for some more specific standards, which is what ICML 55 is. So an obvious question would be, are there any other like-for-like organizations doing similar activities? So let's say, for example, lubrication kind of sits across a few different areas, right? Where lubricant analysis is kind of a predictive maintenance technology, but lubricants themselves are considered assets. So we sort of fit in a number of buckets. But let's say, for example, in the vibration analysis community, are they doing anything there to make ISO 55000 more specific? Or are there any other areas where this is being done, or is ICML a bit of an outlier here?
I have not come across any. I understand your question. You're like, hey, if we thought of this a few years ago to come up with a companion standard for lubrication, then surely some other organization is also thought to come up with a targeted document for their area of expertise. And I have not run across anything, but I'm not out in the field so much as Ken might be. But nothing's been brought to my attention. It's an excellent question. And what do you know, Ken?
No, I absolutely no. Not that I know of. That I think we're breaking new ground. Believe me, Ray, this was a massive undertaking, a very, very expensive undertaking. But an absolute requirement if lubrication is going to be truly understood out there in the world, right? And it's groundbreaking in that perspective. I think we've set the model, is what we've done. Yeah. I think we'll find that in a couple of years' time, we'll be seeing other areas of non-destructive testing utilizing, because that would probably be under a total NDT banner with with vibration and infrared and ultrasonics and stuff. I think all that will come under predictive maintenance banner sort of thing, qualification. But you have to have a governing body that meets all of those together. They don't have that yet.
Yeah.
We have that for lubrication, specific to it, and it's very, very broad. Every machine that's made out of metal or any material that moves, it has to be lubricated. It has to be understood. This tribology that occurs, right? And so we've taken the tribology and made it, we've not gone down the tribology element of it. We've stayed with the practical lubrication management side of it, which is where it all fails.
I guess what I just wanted to highlight with that question was that this is really, really groundbreaking. There was a lot of work and a lot of effort that went into this from the ICML, you know, the technical advisors as well as the board and all this kind of stuff. So, you know, I can encourage this community, the lubrication community, as much as possible to get behind this, because this was a massive effort, but it's also of huge benefit to us, right, as professionals. Right? We now have, in many ways, kind of like the gold standard of how to implement asset management, but specific to our technology, right? And that is something really groundbreaking. I think it's a fantastic thing that the ICML has done. And if you haven't got your copy, or you're not on the wait list, you know, please do so, because all of this stuff needs to be funded. You know, but please get behind the ICML and share it as widely as possible, because I think it's a really good thing that you guys have done.
It's just along those same lines, Rafe. ICML has always been more than just a certification body. Had we been limited in scope for our mission to be just the certification exams and that's it, this may not have crossed the minds of the ICML leaders back, you know, nearly 10 years ago. But because we're also an awards body and a membership body, but a standards body, we've always had some involvement with the different standards. And so when this opportunity presented itself, you know, what good is the ICML if we didn't pursue this? Really, it's within our mission to benefit the practitioners out there. And if we didn't do this, we'd just be totally remiss on our mission. So it was just a natural outgrowth, a natural opportunity.
Well, Paul and Ken, you know, thank you so much for your time. I think that really has clarified, you know, what these documents are for, how they're going to be used, what the intent is in the future. I think that the direction towards certification is something that maybe a lot of people didn't understand. So really, you know, thank you so much for your insight. And if anyone has questions, please chuck them in the comment section below, and we can probably get some answers for you.
Certainly.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Pleasure.